Welcome to the Smart Connector podcast, which looks at the power of connection in business and life. Featuring solo episodes as well as a range of exciting interviews with entrepreneurs across multiple sectors, we offer tips and advice to build your impact, wealth and success, attract others for all the right reasons, and become a smart connector, the architect of your amazing business and life. Daniel DeWolf is an entrepreneur, growth enabler, strategic advisor to startups, and host of the Elevated Pitch podcast, which assists and promotes great businesses that are seeking investment. He works with ambitious founders across multiple sectors to help them define and deliver their vision and amplify and elevate their passion, personality, and drive. In this episode, we discuss the challenge and excitement of growing a business and raising capital for it. And we look at the massive opportunity that exists for startups today. This was a truly thought-provoking and inspiring interview, and I know you'll love listening as much as I enjoyed speaking to Daniel. Welcome, I have a wonderful guest for you today. His name's Daniel DeWolf. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you, Jane. Great to be with you.
So Daniel's the host of the Elevated Pitch podcast, which showcases founders who are seeking investment. And he's got such an interesting story and an interesting product and an interesting thing that he does, because he helps early stage business owners who, particularly in the tech space, actually raise finance for their projects. Isn't that right, Daniel?
Absolutely. It's been an interesting journey, but it's led me to do exactly that.
So, Daniel, what is it about raising investment that inspired and excited you?
I think it's almost raising investment is the end product of a lot of the work that you do, but you don't actually necessarily focus on raising investment because it's a byproduct to some extent. And so the thing that really excites me is building great businesses or helping people to build great businesses. I've had a couple of experience of success and failure and probably learned more of the failure personally, but it's good to have it in relatively equal measure. The really nice thing is to work with people that are passionate about the kind of entity and the business that they're building, because you thrive off that. And it's just such a fun role in life.
Yeah, it really is. And we've had a few conversations ourselves, haven't we, Daniel, about what changes and what comes into the picture when you start to consider investment. So if we can maybe just take a look at that for a moment, what is the catalyst for founders wanting to grow and scale and actually accelerate that process through seeking investment? Why would they want to do that?
There's many reasons why someone would want to take investment on board. There's all sorts of very, very good reasons. For example, usually it's very difficult to grow at scale without investment, without external money's coming into the business. You can't accelerate nearly as quickly. You can't execute on your plan of action or your strategy for, be it global growth or more of a country or regional growth. It's just very difficult. It's also potentially difficult to build products and hire people without a significant kind of capital injection to safeguard those people's jobs when they come into the business. So there's all kinds of reasons. But founding all of them are the ambitions of the founding team or the founders, the businesses that are looking, really. It all still comes back to ambition for me.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think you also made a very good point about investment creating some stability in the early days, because I certainly know I have a group of 3,000 entrepreneurs on Facebook. A lot of them are very early stage. And I know that it doesn't take much, does it, for those young, small businesses to topple over, which is such a shame sometimes and so avoidable.
It absolutely is. There's all sorts of mistakes I've made in the past and other people make frequently around stability, because it's quite an interesting word. And when you talk about stability, you're usually talking about the business's stability. It still comes back to the stability of the individuals running the business. And so when you're in the very, very early stages, when you go full time is usually the first big conundrum, if we call it that, for an individual. And it depends on the risk appetite of that individual. So if you've got a young family or you have dependents or you have significant expense in your life, it can be quite difficult, and you almost get shamed to some extent by social media as to, well, you're not committed. And actually, the very opposite could be very true. But that risk appetite, it's quite an interesting conundrum, usually for people to tackle.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I certainly remember when we sold our business, there was probably a couple of years before that where we were having this debate about will it be good to raise investment? Should we give away some of the capital and actually just get some money into the business so that we can do this and do that? And in the end, the founder said, no, I just don't want to do that. I just want to sell it. He said, I just don't want to have somebody come into the business and actually tell me what to do and try and steer the direction of the business and be answerable to somebody. I mean, in the end, of course, when we did sell it, we were then in an earnout situation. And so we were answerable to someone and, well, in fact, a whole, board of directors, and it was a publicly listed company. So the pressure doesn't go away. It's just it happened after the sale as opposed to before, I suppose. But a lot of people, I think they soldier on and they stay independent very stubbornly because they just don't want that pressure, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. One of the really interesting kind of thought processes when someone is at the start of that journey, and this kind of relates to the example you gave quite well, is that you're actually in the position that we talked to, that we're kind of exempling, as it were. But when you ask somebody what their goal is, and a lot of them will say, well, I want to exit in 3 to 5 years via a trade sale or IPO. And they don't necessarily realize the issues. By issues, I mean kind of the opportunities and the different sets of work that need to be executed to make that happen. But also, actually, the business needs to be worth something to somebody to buy. So the business can't exit. You can exit the business, but the business can't exit from the market. Otherwise, you're just shutting down. And so the strategy for the business has to be well beyond that. Otherwise, nobody's going to buy it.
Yeah.
And equally,
exactly.
as you say, the issue of actually what do you want? Do you want to stay on? And if you don't, then you need to be very careful within those negotiations and set up a business that is exitable rather than fully dependent on the founders. And it becomes a lot of people don't consider any and all of these circumstances, and probably rightly so in the early stages, to be honest. But it has a dramatic effect on the potential of the business long term.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating point, actually, because I don't really think we really thought about it. I certainly didn't think about it because I was obviously part of this business. I was a shareholder. It wasn't my business, but I did have significant shares in it and I did benefit from the sale of the business quite substantially. So at that particular time, I was thinking, well, yeah, I just want to get out of the business. That would be very nice. I would like to leave it when it's sold. And I put my all into it beforehand. And then when we actually got bought, it was like, well, wait a minute. Okay, so now we're on an earnout. So then now I have to do it all over again. And as you said, if we'd actually really, really thought about that right from the beginning, then the strategy might have been different. It might have been, well, let's get to the point where we could actually, it doesn't make any difference whether we are there actively in the business going forward. We could maybe take a more advisory role. And I think that is, as you said, start with the end in mind. It's something that people do need to think about, isn't it?
It is. It absolutely is. And this is why, for me, ambition is so important. And it changes over time, because one thing that everyone should know, and a lot of don't realize to some extent, is you just don't know what you don't know. And some of that you have to find out along the way. And part of that is actually, you might think you want something at the start, and when you get there, you actually don't. And so it's a constantly moving cycle of how can I execute this to the best of my ability, and what do I want from my life and my career and the business and the assets that I've built. There's all sorts of kind of issues that we probably shouldn't go into from really for today, but it's such a fascinating topic because what people want, it affects so many different areas.
Yeah, so I'd love to just talk a little bit about your history, Daniel, and how you came to specialize in this area, because as you said earlier on, you had some startup yourself and you had some successes and some failures. So I'd just love to hear a bit about your own history and background.
Absolutely. So I started in tech about just under 20 years ago now. I worked at BT for my sins in the early days. I moved into software pretty rapidly. And by software, I mean I worked at a bespoke software house. I got a solid education in how people build software. Although I'm not a techie, it's worth saying I do understand how people build businesses around software and the software assets that are created to build them in turn. But my first startup came after that. We were designing a cognitive improvement application that was designed to help reduce the decline in dementia patients. Now, it's worth saying, in the long term, our actual initial plan failed. Although the business is still running, it couldn't achieve what we had initially designed it to achieve. And that's for a variety of reasons. It will take far too long to go into, but we had to scale back. And so a number of us exited the business at that time after about 3.5 years or so. But a decade later, it's still running. So this is kind of one of those pivots that people talk about. For the past kind of 6 or 7 years, I've advised, worked in with and consulted for young and growing organizations on a variety of areas, really. But it all stems around the kind of strategic growth model and how they want to grow, why they want to grow. But imperative within that is the funding cycle. And so finding the right funding from the right partners becomes an integral part of that journey.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So, Daniel, you must know a lot of different types of investors. So what type of investors are out there that would be looking to invest in some of the businesses that you're advising and helping?
I think it's an interesting question. And one of the questions that I always get, or a lot of people get, is, do I know any investors for person A's? Is a random business number one, if we just take an example business, as it were. And it's almost the wrong point to start with, because I don't, as much as I like to think I'm a relatively nice chap, I don't know everyone in London, and I'm sure nobody does, certainly on a personal level. And so I know maybe 30, 40 investors of very different guises, from angels that are very sporadic and participate in crowdfunding rounds at small scale, up to kind of high net worths and various funds, and a couple of private equity organizations as well. And they all obviously focus on different things. And so the real goal when I'm working with someone is to be a lot more surgical about the process and really understand why we want to go to these particular investors and why they would want us to come to them. And that looks at some of their past successes as investors, their past failures where they maybe have lost out on a deal, or all sorts of things like that. So we can actually really understand, okay, well, let's try and work smart, not hard, regarding looking for investors, but then lay hard work over the top of that and really focus on maybe the 10 chances that we think are the most likely. Because chances are, if you've done your homework correct, you're right. But there's probably 4 or 5 different sets, but usually it fits very nicely into 1 or 2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. So what about venture capital, Daniel? Because you talked about private equity, and when I've talked to people in the past, they often say, well, private equity, they'll come in if the business is a bit bigger, but venture capital is more for startups. So, I mean, VCs, what is their kind of appetite for businesses in general? Could you say there is no general? They are all looking for different things and they all have different criteria.
The reason I focus on private equity is because, for the most part, they are setting the standards of what good looks like. Unless you are a very big business, and I mean very big business, they're not going to be interested. And that's okay. And that's absolutely fine. But what it does give you is what they are looking for, why they're looking for it, the metrics of the businesses that they're looking for. And so, to talk about VCs, there is such a wide variety of them. And usually they'll have, so I talk about investors and VCs, if you think about a big swimming pool and everyone sticks to their swim lane, and you've got the deep end and the shallow end of that swim lane. And so you have investors that go from very small scale that we talked about earlier through probably the mid investment. So anything from $500,000 to into the many millions is probably VC land. And there's still, even within that area, there's still a very wide variety of the amount of money. kind of from 5 to probably 10 million, somewhere around there, it's still very narrow usually, and I stress usually, from what they will actually invest in. There'll be specific expertise. Some will genuinely be generalist investors, so they'll happily talk to you about anything. But if you look at the investments they've made, they'll still be geared towards a particular area or particular type of technology or a style of business. It might be food businesses or hospitality and leisure businesses or tax software. I actually have looked at one of those for a client in the past where we found a specifically tax software VC or investor. They weren't actually a VC, but an investor. And so you really do have to look quite carefully at the history of the investor that you're working with to understand if they're going to be appropriate as a potential conversation for you as an individual or a business.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And I get that because I've worked with investors quite a lot in the property space. And of course, in that space, you tend to find that, again, they want to stay in lanes. So I love your analogy of the swimming pool. So there would be the VCs, the private equity guys. They probably all have different lanes if it's going to be like a big Olympic-sized pool. And then, of course, you get the property investors. And within that particular group, there is such a huge and diverse range of individuals, and some of them will be very comfortable taking risk and working on a joint venture basis. They tend to be people who are very experienced. They know how to assess a deal, and they've also got the resources or access to the resources in case things go into trouble and they have to fund some legal costs or whatever. So they tend to be at that end. And then at the other end, you get people who are extremely risk averse and they just want to get a fixed return and just, have it completely and fully secured. And so I totally understand that it is absolutely horses for courses, isn't it, Daniel?
It absolutely is. You're right. I think the risk appetite goes across many, many different areas. And primarily you look at it when we're talking about investors at the moment and understanding what their risk appetite is, how you can reduce their risk, what they're actually looking for when they talk to someone. There's so many different things that you can do to create a better relationship without even talking to them, and almost putting yourself, doing the due diligence on yourself. So kind of almost sitting in a room with a whiteboard and beating yourself or your product and business up a little bit. I know it sounds a bit crude, but it works because other people are going to try and get the skeletons out of the closet. They're going to do that multiple times in all sorts of different ways. So if you've done it already, you're never going to guarantee that nobody finds anything, but they'll find less, which means it's usually a more productive and fluid conversation.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting point. So what you're saying is just be absolutely congruent right from the very start. Don't try and hide anything. Be open and transparent about all your successes, your failures, your struggles, your triumphs, so that effectively you're addressing any of their objections or concerns up front so that they don't have to dig for them.
Absolutely. If you think the first thing that any person, investor or partner, doesn't really matter, but any person you're dealing with on behalf of the business, the first thing they'll look for is trust. Do I trust this individual? Do I trust what they're saying? Do I trust what they're pitching to me? And so how you put yourself across, certainly you talk about, people in general talk about the kind of the first chance to make a first impression. And so how you conduct yourself, what you're saying and why, a lot of that goes into that kind of thought process. So one of my favorite ways to open a meeting, when you're actually meeting someone, I will say, this doesn't go on a deck or a set of information you're sending. One of my favorite things to do is almost why not to invest. So give them an out. If they want an out, they're going to find one anyway. You can't, you're not going to be able to force them to stay and invest money in your business. So it goes back to the theory that I don't want to talk to people that are not interested in me. We're good at what we do. We've got a great product and a great investment opportunity here. So here are the outs. You want to take one or not? I don't want to waste the next hour and a half, 2 hours.
Yeah, I really like that. And it's one of the things that I say because I have this program, Ideal Client Success. So I'm
Mm,
always saying to my mentees, look, some people are not your people, and you should never, ever try and please everyone because you're going to end up pleasing no one. And the whole thing is that you have to be polarizing. And if people can't accept you for the person that you are, then they're not for you. But the worst thing that you can do is to pretend to be something that you're not. And I see people doing this a lot on social media. They go out there bragging about this, that, and the other, and about how they're multimillionaires. And, oh, you just get a whole load of rubbish, don't you? And then, it's totally at odds with what you would find, with what you find out about them subsequently. And as you said, I personally place a great store by trust and
mm.
ethics. I just think it's the number one thing. So, I guess somebody who would be right for me, for example, would be somebody that has those values. And I think that a lot of the time, I would imagine that that's what investors are looking for. They're looking for people who they can trust to behave in a values driven way when the tough times come, because it's never going to be a bowl of cherries all the time, is it?
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. If we kind of step out of investment world and we look to normal sales, which I know I've worked in commercials and you've worked in marketing, and there's a relatively familiar phrase where you want to find the right customers. You want to find the
Hmm.
right customers for your business, and there's a there. The thought process is there is a wrong customer, and it's the same thought process. There is a wrong investor. The problem is they don't tell you that the investors
No,
will always be interested in hearing about new things and hearing about interesting businesses and how they're progressing and what they're doing. And so it's up to the kind of people sat in the business to work out what are they looking for? What is their kind of ideal potential investor? What will be the kind of categorization model of them? And so they you can reduce down the hundreds of potential funds or individuals, and you can try and find an appropriate source of funding. But yeah, it's such an interesting topic, and I don't think it will ever get to a point where it's people talk about it too much, because there's
yeah,
always new people coming in with the kind of rose tinted glasses of what they see on social media and how someone did it well once, and they don't necessarily see the 10 years of hard work that created that one opportunity. Clubhouse is actually a really interesting one, as it's 5 years of hard work that created an overnight success in the truest sense of the word. And that is a perfect example because they've been around for a long time, but it's only recently that they actually launched, and there's obviously all sorts of value that people are getting from, myself included, although I go through fits and spurts, as it were. But it's a good example of how you need to put the work in to earn the right to move to the next level.
Yeah, and you're so right. There are no overnight sensations, much as people would like to think that there are. It really is. There's this diagram that I often see with the iceberg, and people see the tip of the iceberg, but they don't
Yeah,
see the great big lump that's underneath the surface.
absolutely.
And that's all the work, isn't it?
It is. It really is. But it's for me, it's the failure. It's the level
Hmm.
of failure, and for me, failure
Yeah,
equals learning. And
yeah,
I'm not scared of using the F word, as it were. I don't mind a failure being attributed to me, because I'm going to learn and I'm going to improve. And the only reason I do what I do is because actually I failed a lot rather than I've succeeded a lot. I have also succeeded, to be clear. I'd rather, it's important to point that out, but it's the process in which you harness the learning that really makes a difference to me. And so you almost, especially with tech, but all kinds of organizations, there will be constant sets of mini failures from I put the wrong price up, or the messaging doesn't work particularly well, or this is not the right brand, whatever it may be. So people constantly fail and improve, but it's kind of the internal mechanisms to recognize and amend and be honest with yourselves within the team that this needs changing. That's how the progression works usually. I say usually, and that's
yeah.
probably the operative word there.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating topic, isn't it? Because I often think that it's the degree of agility and flexibility in that respect that actually makes a difference. A lot of the time, from people actually staying the course and achieving success in the end, and just kind of not managing it. I mean, I know that sometimes there are factors completely outside of people's control, and of course nobody can do anything about things like COVID or the economy or whatever. But there are also, as you said, it's like embarking on this journey, isn't it? I mean, I think that's a thing that I find exciting really about entrepreneurship, that you're just putting one foot in front of another. And once you can actually get past the fear of failure, which of course, if you can't do, then you shouldn't really be an entrepreneur. Then it's a big adventure, isn't it? And as you said, you're going to open some doors and they'll be the wrong doors, and open the others and they'll be the right ones. And that happens every day sometimes.
Multiple times a day for me, multiple times a day, and always will. For me, one of it's the risk, again, that risk that you made reference to, and that kind of process as of kind of learning. If you're kind of scared to fail, there's ways of mitigating that. And part of the process of ambition is to work out almost what you want to do. Is a lot of people work better in teams, where that's where you find co-founders. And so some people, they wouldn't want to do it on their own, but maybe because they don't have, or they don't think they have the experience, or they don't really think they fulfill most of the criteria of what they need, or the different skill sets, whatever it may be. So they want to put a team together to put things forward. And actually, a lot of investors say that is a better way to achieve things. And the only reason that, all I mean by that, is that VCs prefer, in general terms, a co-founding team rather than one co-founder to invest a strategic amount of money and a significant amount of money. Some don't mind, and it's not to say it's bad, but it's the part of what kind of evidence tells us is that having more people to kind of pick things apart and focus on different things, it makes the process easier. It's not undoable by any stretch of the imagination. And I think a lot of it depends on the individual types of businesses and the differentiation between the individuals as well. But there's just a preference for it from the investment community. And so for me, the question is, okay, you're great at that one thing. What are all the other things that you're not so great at? And can we get to stage X without those? And if we can't, then how do we fill that gap? And it doesn't necessarily automatically mean that you bring somebody else and you give them shares or anything like that. It just means that we need to fill that gap. And there's all sorts of different ways of doing that. Again, it's the honesty in looking internally that opens yourself up to those kind of critical conversations, but critical from both internally, you're critiquing yourself, but also it's critical from an investment point of view, because without those conversations, you won't necessarily be as valuable to an investor.
Yeah, again, it's a fascinating conversation, because I've seen this so many times as well. I've seen partnerships that they're not really very robust because they're two people that do the same things, and there's power struggles because they're both trying to do the same thing whilst ignoring the other things. So I've seen that. And then I've seen other people who want to hang on to the lion's share when really they need the commitment of other people in the business, but because they've they just won't give up that 51% or whatever, even though they are very, very heavily dependent on these other people, then that creates inequalities and resentments. But then, of course, if they then become more of a minority shareholder, then there's implications of that. And it is quite hard to get it right, really, isn't it?
That's a perfect statement to make. It is quite hard to get it right, because with the example of, yes, you're potentially more successful in a team, there's a whole raft of kind of issues, like it's opening another can of worms to some extent with agreements between the co-founders. I've seen like long-term friendships broken up because of a business. And so picking those people quite strategically, and if you do want to enter a team, and making sure that you're both covered and that you both have the same ethics, ethos, outlook, goals, ambitions, and all sorts of things like that is so important, because otherwise that mire of kind of controversy will just be waiting down the line. And it's happened to me in the past. I'm sure most people that have been in multiple businesses will have had some kind of disagreement along some way. It's just more often than not the case.
So I remember I was talking to somebody fairly recently, and he was saying that his criteria for investing in a business, or one of his criteria, would be no boardroom conflicts. So, how would an investor, for example, be able to look at that from the outside and actually work out whether, a board or a team is putting on a good show, putting on a good front, or actually they really are meshing together in a way that, gives the business some sustainability and a future?
I'm intrigued by that, to be honest. It sounds almost like a tick box. I would assume that there's obviously minutes of meetings, of board meetings from a legal standpoint, but for the most part it's quite high level. I would be interested to learn more about what that person deems as evidence to some extent as to what proves that, disproves that. I suppose in general terms what they're looking for is a kind of a collaborative and cooperative C-suite that drive the business forward and are all interested in doing that. In which case, actually almost observing them and working with them for a period of time and having multiple meetings, see how they interact. There's nothing quite like being in a room with someone to work out what someone is like. And when you're trying to work out the dynamics and the harmony of an organization, it's almost, I'll just sit in your office for a day or two. I've seen that in the past, but it depends on the individual. There's also very different types of investors as well. And so when you're looking at angels are potentially a lot more emotional with their investments because it's their money and it's something that they would want to do. And so that might be something that an angel potentially is looking for rather than a fund. And that there's no bad about that. It might just be that they want to understand if they're the kind of their kind of person, to say it kind of bluntly, as it were, that they have a very similar outlook and that they operate in a very similar way. Because the fundamental decision that person's making before money or anything like that is, do I want to spend at least a good couple of hours in a room with this person every day or every month for the next 5 years, potentially, if not more? And so there's a relationship that they're buying into. With that, it would probably be on that side of the due diligence, I would guess. But I'm intrigued by that. I'll do a bit more digging on it.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I remember when we were bored, we had to do some psychometric testing, and to be honest, I've done quite a lot of psychometric testing over the years, and it never really surprises me because I think, well, yeah, I know this about myself and I know this about that other person, and it always kind of highlights strengths and weaknesses and so on. But what it doesn't really test, or at least I haven't really found any psychometric test that actually, and I mean, I could be completely wrong here because I'm sure that there are some that really accurately assess values and culture and behavior. Because, of course, the cultural aspects of a business is really important in terms of things like employee retention and just general kind of happiness levels, whether people give their all or whether they're just going through the motions and all of those things. And I would have thought if I was an investor, that would be one of the first things that I would really want to kind of, dig into and actually understand. Because I think I've seen it in the past, it just makes such a kind of huge difference.
You're absolutely right. It's almost incalculable if you're almost agreeable to that way of thinking and that kind of mindset to some extent. You're absolutely right. You could almost exchange that for many other things as well, where the kind of process or the mindset or whatever it may be, everyone has a particular, almost a kind of golden egg that they're looking for. And they don't necessarily tell you about it, right? And so part of the process of this is why the due diligence that you do on the investors is so important, because that slight differentiation of focus on what you really dive down into based on each individual investor. It could be how the company and the team work together. It could be the leadership style. It could be the product. It could be all of it, to be honest. And there is always an element of all of it, obviously, although they're not going to invest in a company that has a great product but nothing else. Equally a great team but nothing else. It just doesn't work. So there's a balance there, but there's usually an area where people specialize. And this is where understanding, okay, well, why and how did they invest in this business? How have they made money? What is their focus? And it could absolutely be the example you give, but it's worth stating that it could be many other things, and this is part of the issue of potentially changing and having 70. If you do 50 to 60 different presentations to investors, you could have 50 to 60 to 70 different presentation slide decks, because they all need to be slightly managed and different, and it's a growing process. And you do it through feedback, and you do it through, you kind of drill down, and eventually you've got this really crystal clear and driven approach towards what you want and why you want it. But it's through experience and failure and repeated learning that usually you get there.
Amazing. So, Daniel, I'd love to hear about some of the businesses that you've helped or that you're helping. I know that maybe you might not be able to talk about all of them, but if you could just give us some examples, that would be great. And the sort of businesses that they are, what they're looking for, what sort of level of investment they've been looking for, and what they're going to do with it.
Absolutely. So, like, the first example I give is Safe Citizens, where we've been working for a decent while now, and the technology is what the business is based on. It's a platform that is public safety driven. It's a location services platform that allows the emergency services to respond better in a crisis scenario, in an emergency scenario. And we're not just looking at the UK here, where we think an emergency is a fire, an explosion, whatever it may be. We're looking at natural disasters, so wildfires, floods, and obviously there's a lot of the world that has, I say thankfully from a UK point of view, we don't suffer that an awful lot, but there are other parts of the world that do very heavily. And so the idea of the platform is to provide a better situational awareness to those in charge so they can deploy resources more effectively. They're looking for 2.5 million at the moment in order to grow out the platform. I'm kind of acting as the head of strategy, chief strategy officer. And we're building out the thought process, the ethos, how people respond to the thought that people do want to keep them safe, and the methods of doing that. There's a huge number of areas that need investment, which is why it comes in that we actually need to seek external investment rather than continue to bootstrap. Another one, which is completely on the opposite end of the line, it's a wonderful chap, a wonderful family man who is an interior designer. And he is looking to start a business based off the premise of telling people stories. And what I mean by that is that he will work with an art therapist, and he will work with probably a couple of, so he's focused on two areas initially and two causes, one being people who are displaced and the other starting to be mental health. And so he works with the art therapist to record these people's stories. He puts their stories into an incredibly lovely design. I've got a couple of products downstairs, so I can speak firsthand of their delightful nature, and then sells the products based off these people's stories, benefiting all those concerned. It's called A Million Stories as a result. But the products are luxury, kind of handcrafted in British products. The first one is a cushion that tells the story of 3 displaced people from Syria. There's a few other causes and other patterns in general, but it was such an interesting project to work on and continue to work on, because there's such an interesting story behind it, and the person behind it and his family they're such a lovely bunch of people, and so it makes it an absolute delight to work with them, to be honest.
And that's also what it's all about. It's also about having fun, isn't it? I mean, life's too short not to.
This is it. And as much as, and I suppose I go back to ambition, that my ambition isn't necessarily to make the absolute most money in the world, although I know we're in business and I'm not scared of it. But I want to balance that with working with people that I really enjoy working with and making sure that my costs are not breaking them and there's an equal relationship that is potentially very long term. And it's quite important to me that that's actually the case rather than just saying that, as it were. And so when working with A Million Stories, that's kind of come to the fore, where we're trying to build the right business for Simon and the right business for his family and the right business for his ambitions. And that all comes into the mix of what we do and why we do it and how. But yeah, there's been some wonderful successes and failures along the way. And it's hopefully going to grow at a rate of knots in the coming months and years. That's for sure. The nice thing for him is that at the appropriate time, which is probably a couple of months away, we'll look for a potential investment. But that's a decision to take in the future, not now. The main thing is building the right business. And that doesn't necessarily always have to include investment. There's nothing wrong with bootstrapping or creating a lifestyle business or another number of reasons why investment might not be the right thing for a business. It's got to be the right thing on a number of levels to really validate the effort that goes into raising an amount of money, regardless of the amount, really.
Yeah, so it's not all about just getting a whole load of developers and producing some original tech and AI. And I think a lot of people just think that it's only those types of businesses that can attract investment.
It's absolutely not. And obviously, technology is quite significant for a very good reason, that it's quite well documented, the value that technology companies provide to investors. However, it's not the be-all and end-all for a lot. And this is where looking at the type of investment you want and the type of investors that are potentially available to you, you come to a decision. And even if you want investment, you might not. And it might be, again, something quite interesting is property, where there's such a, obviously, investment in property there's such a well-trodden path. There's kind of one way of doing it, or one kind of set of ways of doing it for the most part, although there's a few people trying to break the mold potentially now with crowdfunding properties and things like that in property technology worlds. But with most other industries, it's actually very fluid. There's such a wide variety of how you can operate, even from a cafe point of view. If someone wanted to start a cafe, are they going to be the next Nero, or are they just going to be another independent cafe? Are they, and like from a shop point of view, are they going to be a new eco-friendly supermarket that goes global like Tesco's was at one point? Or are they going to be, no, they're just kind of one store? And a lot of it comes to, do they want investment? Do they want to really push the boat out and accept that risk? But there are different ways of handling that. I suppose one of the interesting things is supermarket delivery has seen a huge rise, food delivery and supermarket delivery off the back of that. So if you look at the levels of investment that around supermarket delivery, yes, there will be an element of technology backbone, but that is not the offering. The offering is a scalable business. And so it becomes quite interesting. Okay, well, is that a technology business? Some people would definitely count it as such because there is probably a large portion of technology that enabled that business. But are they a logistics business? In which case, could Addison Lee have done what they were doing? Which, for those who don't know who they are, Addison Lee are a taxi and courier firm in the London area for the most part, but I'm sure in other areas as well. And so it's the ambition and the want of the business as to how they flex up, flex down, or just stay on a nice, even, relatively low risk path. There's so many different areas, and tech is a big part of it. It's not the only one.
Wow, that's so fascinating, Daniel. So what advice would you give then to somebody that's actually at that junction and they're just thinking, should I go for it or not?
I think the main thing is to work out what you want. And it doesn't necessarily, you don't necessarily have to have all the answers to that, but you have to have an idea, because it's the fuel of your ambition, and where your ambition lies is really the fuel of everything. that you will put effort into. And so if you don't think you really want it, you're not going to really put as much the required effort into it. Or you might think that I want to be the chief marketing officer or the chief product officer or something like that. Then you'll probably need a co-founder, but you really want to do it, just not as the kind of the face and the leader, as it were. You want to be one of the leaders. There's what you want comes into so many different angles and assets, and the ambition that backs that up. That's the first thing I would always think about. A lot of people think they've done the homework on that. I would argue that a sizable majority haven't, or they haven't done it for a good little while, and they're kind of running off more of an assumption as to where they should or shouldn't go. So do that homework, really focus on it, understand it, look at every angle that you possibly can, and then part of the process is once the ambition is kind of nailed to some extent, it's then a strategy of how to execute that.
And I think the important thing as well is that you talk about ambition, or you talked about it a lot, but ambition is really something that sometimes it's quite hard to gauge in yourself. And it's quite hard, isn't it, without having a sounding board to actually know, well, what do I really want? What do I really want is a really big question. And I think a lot of people are just not able to answer it for themselves.
And you're absolutely right, Jane. And that is absolutely fine. There is no negative in not knowing all the answers. The thing that you've got to work out is, what do I know? And then potentially have a conversation with someone like yourself or someone like myself. I've spoken to many, many times over the amount of clients that I ever have, and I wouldn't have it any other way. The number of people I speak to and don't work with because it's not the right thing for them, it's not the right thing for me, or I think there's somebody else that could help them better, or they want more of a specific set of expertise than I think, whatever it may be, many reasons. So I actually had a conversation with a couple of guys lovely guys from Brighton that had developed quite a specific process of marketing a new clothing brand, as it were. And they were very good at what they did. They were kind of practitioners of an art form of videography. And they came and said, look, we want to raise investment. I was like, okay, well, why? He said, well, that's kind of what you do, isn't it, when you're scaling a business? So, well, we had a half an hour chat, and I basically just told them, guys, you don't want to raise investment, and that's absolutely fine. You want to grow the business, but what you want to do is do it in a stable and kind of reduced risk manner, because what you want to do is just continue what you're doing, and that is absolutely fine. It's entirely up to the individuals, but it's that ambition that counts before everything else. And then you've got an active process that you can enact. It's a lot more straightforward once you understand, okay, do I know or do I not know?
Yeah, and I think that's really, really good, Daniel, because the thing is, if you go out there, you're giving people the right advice, you're engaging with them, then everybody has a network, don't they? If you're out there building a business, then you have a network, and the right people will come to you for sure.
Absolutely. And this is one of the reasons why, for certainly my point of view, I always want to talk to people. I really enjoy networking. I've done it an awful lot. I've gotten a huge amount of value out of some of the new forms of networking since lockdown occurred, and always tried to look for how I can help people. And there's a lot of other people that have done the same with me and helped me hugely. And so there's always this is what I kind of mean by the right type of client. And I want to find the right clients that I can help with. That doesn't mean all of the clients that knock on my door are the right clients, because they might be in the different stage of growth. It might not be me that helps them. In fact, I was speaking to another organization last week, and they've invited me on a training course as they deal with almost the next level or two up of businesses that are more growing into kind of Series B and C kind of stage from an investment stage. So looking for more tens of millions and that kind of level of business, and have multiple millions of revenue. And so actually there's a lot you can learn off all of those different aspects, but opening yourself up to a network is a great thing to do.
Definitely. Well, Daniel, it's just been such a pleasure to speak to you today. I just want to thank you very much for sharing all your wisdom and insights with us. And so you have a podcast. And so how would people find your podcast if you just like to give it a plug?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the podcast is called Elevated Pitch. It's on all of the various podcast channels, for the most part, at least, certainly Apple and Spotify and Google. There's a website called elevated-pitch.com, on LinkedIn and all of the other stuff as well. The podcast is effectively an investment teaser. Each episode is an investment teaser from a business pitching for investment. So if anyone is interested in holding an episode, it's very different to yours, which is one of the nice experiences of coming on yours, because I've been the other side of the mic, and it's nice to have been the opposite side, as it were.
Definitely. All right. And Daniel, how else can people get in touch with you? Where do you hang out most? Would it be LinkedIn or?
Yeah, so most of the time I will be active on LinkedIn. So Clubhouse I'm on occasionally, but very much LinkedIn, or email is daniel@dewolf.co if anyone wants to get in touch.
Okay, lovely. Well, thanks again, Daniel, and I'll look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thanks very much, Jane. A pleasure to be on the show.
Thanks for listening in. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to, rate, and review my podcast, as it will help me bring the power of connection to the world. I work one-to-one to help entrepreneurs ignite the power of authentic connection in their businesses and lives. I also help them accelerate their results through attracting and converting more of their ideal clients. And if this is something you'd like to do too, why not head on over to www.idealclientsuccess.com/masterclass, and I'll show you how.